Welcome to Jewish History Soundbites podcast with Yehuda Geberer. Immerse yourself in the rich tapestry of Jewish history as we explore fascinating tales and uncover hidden gems from our glorious past. Brought to you by our proud sponsor, Cross River, a leader at the intersection of financial services and technology, committed to empowering the communities they serve. Cross River's steadfast support fuels our mission to preserve our heritage and foster a vibrant future for all. Contact Cross River through their website at crossriver.com.
A date which will live in infamy.
Both
of those projects, initiatives, got off the ground because of the Guerrero.
For the 11 Olympic team members slain in West Germany, the Olympic Games...
Zugerecht Brüder in Amerika.
Out of the 24 who were killed were Americans who had come to learn in Hebron.
I say 1 million Jewish children who were made to be cut loose.
Whoever heard such beautiful words?
It is never too little.
Yehuda Geberer with Jewish History Soundbites, and this episode is going to be our final installment about the Eichmann trial. I'm actually calling it After the Eichmann trial because it's talking about the after effects, the aftershocks. Maybe in the future someday we'll do more episodes about Eichmann's capture and about his crimes during the Holocaust. But I think that's enough Eichmann for now. This whole series was a lot of fun. I enjoyed it. It seems from the feedback that I got that you enjoyed it as well. So I think this will suffice, and maybe we'll get back to other elements of the Eichmann story in the future. I've gotten, again, enormous amount of feedback. There was one really good one that I wanted to address directly, so I'm going to read it. The knowledgeable and dedicated listener who submitted this email numbered his points, so I'm going to address each point as I read the email. So it'll be, between what he's saying and what I'm saying. I hope it's not too confusing. So here it goes. I listened to your series so far on the Eichmann trial and thought some other points could be brought out. Number one, the role of producer Milton Fruchtman and director Leo Horowitz in broadcasting the trial when television was in its infancy, and how it almost didn't happen because the judges did not want to see the cameras. That's an excellent point, because the justices of the Eichmann trial wanted it to be a formal trial, a serious trial, and they didn't want it to be just a TV circus. So they did not want any cameras to be seen in the courtroom. So they had to kind of hide the cameras, and it was broadcast around the world and all in Israel and around the world. This is again 1961. TV wasn't huge in Israel at all, and not even so much in most places in the world. So it was a big deal to have these cameras set up and have it broadcast. Okay, next point. Number two, and before number two, the fact that it was for posterity. In other words, there was the immediate reception of the trial at the time, but the fact that all of the proceedings of the trial were recorded for posterity and we can all view the testimonies until today is quite important and quite historic. So that's a very, very good point. Number two, there seems to be a story about why the tapes of the interviews by journalist Wilhelm Sassen were not played at the trial, and instead they read from the transcripts. Yes, there is a story. The story was that they did not have access to the original recordings until a few years ago. So the transcripts from the recordings of the famous Sassen interviews, which, like I said, I think in a previous installment, Eichmann gave these interviews in 1957 to the Dutch Nazi in Argentina, Wilhelm Sassen, and where he justified his crimes, where he explained his role in the final solution. Very, very incriminating evidence, very, very important. And transcripts from those interviews were used at the trial against Eichmann by the prosecution. Now, they did not have the recordings at the time. They did not have access to the recordings at the time, and it was for many, many years that they did not have it. Only in recent years have the original recordings been accessible to researchers, and there's been a lot of use. Books have been written based on the Sassen interviews, and I think at least one movie has been made based on it also. It's really, really important and really, really interesting now that we have the original recordings, the tape reels, I guess we'll call them, from those interviews. Number 3, did they actually prove conclusively that Eichmann was responsible for the implementation of the final solution? And what I would say to that, just to clarify a misunderstanding, they proved conclusively that Eichmann was responsible for his role in the final solution. Eichmann was not responsible for the implementation of the final solution. He was an officer of the SS who had a major role to play, especially regarding the deportations themselves. He was the train master. He was the deportations master. He definitely was not the officer in charge. Of course, Himmler as head of the SS, Heydrich until his assassination, Kaltenbrunner, and many, many, many other senior SS officers who were involved in the implementation of the final solution. Eichmann, of course, has an outsized role because he's the most senior officer who was able to escape after the war from Germany, make it to Argentina. He, of course, was captured in a very dramatic kidnapping by the Mossad in Argentina and brought to Israel to stand trial, and then he has this incredible trial. So Eichmann's role has this incredible stage for the world, and so much has been written about it, but he by no means was the SS officer who was responsible. He was one of many, and it was proved conclusively at the trial that Eichmann was responsible. In other words, aside from everything we've been speaking about how it was important to confront the story of the Holocaust, and how the witnesses related their narrative, and the Jewish people confronted the Holocaust, and Israeli society confronted the Holocaust, and Hausner and Ben-Gurion himself really, they wanted the trial to be really a overall overview of the Holocaust, and not necessarily were many of the witnesses even related to Eichmann's crimes, and I really emphasized that the last couple of episodes, but we shouldn't lose focus that, of course, over the course of the trial, they obviously also proved Eichmann's guilt. That goes without saying to a certain extent. Number 4, and this is the last point of this listener's email. And lastly, Abba Kovner's account of his conversation with Yitzchak Wittenberg, who gave up his life so others could be saved, was also a very powerful display of what Jewish heroism is. And that is an excellent, excellent point. Abba Kovner in his testimony explained what happened in the Jewish resistance in Vilna. And the head of the Jewish resistance in Vilna was a Jewish communist named Yitzchak Wittenberg. And first of all, the Jewish resistance in Vilna is all types of Jews working together. So Abba Kovner is a Zionist, Yitzchak Wittenberg is a communist, and there's many other types as well. So the Jews unite in fighting against the Nazis. Okay, that's not that's kind of, I guess we could kind of expect that. But what happens is that Wittenberg is caught. And as a head of the resistance, he's caught with arms, and he goes into hiding. Meaning there's like wanted signs for him around the ghetto, basically. The Jewish ghetto police and the infamous head of the Jewish Judenrat in the Vilna ghetto, Yaakov Genz, who is a very, very controversial figure. There's a lot to say about him, and maybe one day when we do a story about the Vilna ghetto, we have a lot to say about him. And he, very controversial figure, but also a very complex figure. So it's a good story. It's always an interesting story when it's controversial and complex. And so Wittenberg goes into hiding. Genz and his Jewish police are after him because the Nazis want him. The Nazis demand that the Judenrat find him, and they, obviously come up with all kinds of threats that they'll kill everyone, and many more Jews will be killed if he doesn't turn himself in. And Genz demands that Wittenberg turn himself in, or else, in other words, or else many other Jews will be killed. And Wittenberg goes ahead and publicly gives himself up. He comes out of hiding, and he turns himself in to the Jewish ghetto police, to the Judenrat, who turns him over to the Nazis. and he does this. He literally walks through the ghetto streets to turn himself in, and he does this to save the lives of others. So that was a very, 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 very heroic moment, and Kovner succeeded him as the head of the resistance in the Vilna ghetto. Wittenberg is killed. I think Wittenberg's handgun, his pistol, is on display in the Yad Vashem Museum, if I'm not mistaken, if I remember that correctly. But in any event, it's here's this Jewish communist head of the resistance, who has very little in common with the Jewish masses of the Vilna ghetto, but in order to save their lives, he goes ahead and turns himself in. So that's a great story of Jewish heroism. So that's the feedback. I just wanted to go over those points. And now I want to get to the goal of this final episode is really after the trial, not the trial itself, but the wider aftershocks or the after effects of the trial in a much more broader sense worldwide, not just in Israel, not just among the Jewish people in Jewish history, but really throughout the entire world. So in a very narrow sense, we kind of already mentioned it last episode, that this, on the victim side, the witnesses side, this really brings out the story of the Holocaust, and now the survivors are accepted for who they are, and their story is now able to be told. Survivor memoirs start to come out. Survivor stories, interviews eventually. The Holocaust becomes part of the Jewish consciousness, the world consciousness. Of course, Hollywood gets on board, and that's a rather important story as well about how it brings it to the wider public. The story, books are published. Historians get more serious about researching the Holocaust. Holocaust museums start to be built around the world. And really, the Eichmann trial completely transforms how Jewish society, Israeli society, and world society confront the story of the Holocaust. That's the most basic component, which I think I already mentioned. There's another part of the story that I promised to get back to, and I want to mention it, not so at length, but rather briefly, the Hannah Arendt angle of the trial and the controversy that she generated. Hannah Arendt as a person, I don't really have anything positive to say about her, so I don't want to get into her own biography. She's this German Jew who escapes from the Nazis. She's this philosopher and writer, very prominent individual, but she's this intellectual snob and racist against her own people. Not a great person in her personal life. She had relationships with Nazi supporters, non-Jewish Nazi supporters in Germany, and whatever. A lot to say, and nothing about it is positive. So I want to focus on is not her as a person, but more her book. And what she said about the trial, her very, very famous book, Eichmann in Jerusalem, and what it generated. So the main points of her book were the subtitle of the book, A Report on the Banality of Evil. And she coined this phrase, the banality of evil, and that's the main theme of the book, analyzing Eichmann himself during his own trial and how he appeared during the trial and how he tried to defend himself. So the main idea that she coined in this banality of evil is that Eichmann comes across as not a monster, not someone who's this ideologue. At least that's how he came across in his trial, but really someone who is the banality of evil. That he seems so regular, so like Eichmann tried to portray himself as this office guy, a bureaucrat, doing his job, just following orders, doing his duty, obeying the law, being a good officer. He doesn't claim, he claims no personal responsibility for the crimes, and he doesn't display any guilt. And this is the kind of like the horror of the evil is that it's so banal, it's so regular, it's so normal. And that is kind of like the scary part of this Eichmann story that she was trying to bring out, that evil doesn't always come out as a monster, as a ideological racial anti-Semite, which obviously Eichmann was, but we're talking about how he tried to pass himself over at the trial, and really the scary part of the crimes and the criminal that Eichmann was is that he could come across at the trial as, a guy with a suit and tie and thick glasses and trying to present his narrative and his part of the story, and his part of the story is incredibly evil, but it's the banality of evil, because he doesn't come across like that. That was actually the least controversial part of her book, and even that generated controversy because she seemed to be brushing over the fact that he was an ideological anti-Semite. She seemed to be accepting Eichmann's defense at face value. On the other hand, the idea that the SS murderers were psychotic, psychopathic murderers obviously wasn't true. I mean, that's proven by the Israelis themselves. They sent, no less than 6 psychologists were sent. It's a Jewish country. There's no shortage of psychologists. Were sent by the Israeli government to analyze and examine Eichmann during his time in prison. And these psychologists found no trace of mental illness, no trace of personality disorder, no trace of schizophrenia. He seemed he was absolutely normal. That's what they paskin. That's what they diagnose, these psychologists. So there is this element of the banality of evil that's evident in Eichmann and his behavior, which kind of makes it all the more scary about how a criminal like that is. That itself generated plenty of controversy, but that was the least controversial element of her book. There were at least two other much more controversial claims that she made in the book. Number one, the legality of the trial. She tried to claim that the whole trial was illegal, which many around the world, including the UN, said because Eichmann was kidnapped from Argentina and the state of Israel didn't exist during that time, that he committed his crimes and they were not committed on Israeli soil, and they were crimes in retrospect. They were retroactive crimes. So she said this was just a show trial. It wasn't a real trial. It's because Ben-Gurion wanted to talk about the Holocaust, and Hausner wanted to bring out the crimes of the Holocaust, and they wanted to bring witnesses to the Holocaust that had nothing to do with Eichmann. So, and she gave her whole spiel like that, which was a common criticism at the time. I personally see that was the point of the trial. And Eichmann, like I said, I've been saying in these episodes, and that's totally legitimate. Ben-Gurion himself said, "It is not an individual nor the Nazi regime on trial, but anti-Semitism throughout history." That's on trial, and specifically the story of the Holocaust and the final solution. So that's I don't see that as such an issue. Neither did most other people, but that was one of the claims that she made. The other one that was even more controversial was that she addressed the Jewish leadership and Jewish cooperation with the Nazis in the final solution itself. And that also became a very controversial topic. The Jewish leadership in general, the Jewish leadership in the ghettos, the Jewish leadership in communities where they, I mentioned last week, Freudiger's testimony, things like that. She had pretty critical things to say about Jewish leadership during the Holocaust. The sum total of it was that it became this incredibly controversial book, and all these assertions that she made generated this massive response. And ultimately, whether she was wrong or right, and she likely was wrong in most of her assessments, but the fact that she published it and so soon after the trial, and she had been a reporter on the trial, was a good thing because it generated decades of response. In other words, so many great books and research has come out of it. Deborah Lipstadt and David Cesarani and all these many other authors wrote books in response to Hannah Arendt. In other words, she generated so much response and so much discussion and so much research about the Holocaust and perpetrator research and victim research and Jewish leadership in the war. So ultimately, in the long term, it was actually a good thing because all this response and all this disproving her theories and her opinions there's so much that came out of it. Literally for decades to come, even in recent years, there's still been books that were published. Just to give you an idea of what an awful person she was as a person, she wrote a letter to the German philosopher, German non-Jewish philosophers. He was not a Nazi, but German philosopher Karl Jaspers. She wrote this letter to him about the trial. She writes, "My first impression of the trial that on top the judges were the best of German jury. Below them the prosecuting attorneys, Galicians, but still Europeans." And she specifically writes about Hausner, that he was a typical Galician Jew, constantly making mistakes, probably one of those people who doesn't know any language. And then she continues writing in this letter, "Everything is organized by a police force that gives me the creeps. They speak only Hebrew and they look Arabic. Some downright brutal types among them. They would obey any order. And outside the doors of the courtroom, the Oriental mob, as if one were in Istanbul or some other half-Asiatic country. In addition, and very visible in Jerusalem, the Payas and Kaftan Jews, who make life impossible for all reasonable people here." Now, that is so anti-Semitic and so racist that it's hard to believe that a Jew would write such a thing. I don't call her a self-hating Jew or something. So besides for all her interesting ideas in her book, Eichmann in Jerusalem, just she as a person, the way she viewed other Jews, the way she viewed this with intellectual snobbery that was common among the intellectual elite of German Jewry before the war, the way they looked at Ostjuden, Eastern European Jews. And in fact, her friend of many years, Gershom Scholem, who himself was a German Jew and a great intellectual and a great professor and researcher, he broke off he was friends with Hannah Arendt for decades, and he broke off all relations with her. He stopped talking to her. Didn't correspond with her afterwards. He said, "You're a hater of Jews. What you wrote is terrible. What you wrote in your book is terrible." And he broke off all any connection with her afterwards. So it's interesting how Hannah Arendt, just with her writings, generated so much controversy and so much of a story after the trial. But like I said, ultimately it brought out a lot of the research and a lot of the great books that we have about the Holocaust and the Eichmann trial. So there was some good that came out of it. I want to move on to another topic that goes way, way, way beyond the Jewish story here in the trial. And I want to elaborate first on Eichmann's defense. Eichmann gave his defense, which was kind of like a repeat of the Nuremberg trial's defense of just following orders. The just following orders defense actually has antecedents even before the Holocaust, even before Nuremberg, in centuries before, actually after World War I also, but even centuries earlier. There was this idea that officers can claim in crimes that they're accused of that they're just following orders. And over time, this defense was less and less accepted in the courtroom because there's personal responsibility of something that is objectively a crime, especially if it's an internationally recognized as a crime. And therefore, it was not accepted at Nuremberg, and nor was it accepted by the Eichmann trial. It's just an anecdote that I happen to like repeating and how it plays out years later. In 1968, the U.S. military is fighting a war in Vietnam. The Vietnam War, interesting war in its own right. Maybe one day we'll talk about the Jewish connection to the Vietnam War, because there are quite a few. So that would be an interesting story. But in the Vietnam War, one of the controversial elements of the war was that since it was not a war about territory, it was a war to defeat communism, the North Vietnamese military as well as the South Vietnamese Viet Cong. So it was not really about occupying territory, but it was more like destroying the communist presence there. So helicopters would land in an area, destroy the communist presence, and then they would the helicopters would come back and take out the American soldiers. And very often the communists would come right back there. So how do you measure success? So what emerged as a policy of the American military was body counts, basically, that if they killed a lot of communists, a lot of North Vietnamese soldiers or Viet Cong, then that means they were winning. They're not about territorial gains, but more about body counts. But that was a skewed incentive, because this way, if they landed in an area where there were no communists, because the intelligence was faulty, they would have an incentive to kill local villagers and civilians who were not communists, because this way they have a body count. And that's exactly what happened. And one of the most famous massacres during the Vietnam War was the My Lai massacre in 1968, perpetrated by a battalion in the American Army. And it was, and they were, eventually it came to the attention of the American military that this massacre took place in the My Lai village. Men, women, and children, civilians, unarmed, were just machine gunned to death. And there was a terrible crime and tragedy. And the American soldiers who were responsible for it were arrested and tried. One of the officers, who was eventually convicted and served some time in jail, was a lieutenant by the name of William Calley. And at his trial, his defense at his trial, which was largely successful because he only got a very light prison sentence, which was eventually even commuted. I think he served a year and a half or something, maybe even less, was, I was just following orders. In other words, he was ordered to kill the Vietnamese in that area because they are communists, they're Viet Cong, they're hiding weapons, they're supporting the communists, whatever it was. And therefore, despite the fact that they seemed like just innocent civilians, men, women, and children who were unarmed, he decided to carry out the massacre because he was just following orders. And it kind of overturned Nuremberg justice. It kind of overturned the Eichmann trial justice, which was just 8 years earlier. It was just a few years earlier. And in fact, when he was confronted during the massacre by a helicopter pilot named Hugh Thompson, he was a very famous helicopter pilot because he's the one who's credited with stopping the My Lai massacre. He was witness to it and he put a stop to it. He's like, what are you doing? So he goes down, he lands his helicopter, he confronts William Calley, and he says, why are you doing this? Why are you killing these innocent civilians? And Calley responds with the exact words, just following orders, which is incredible. And he then uses that at his trial also, but he uses that even during the massacre, while the crime is taking place. So that is something to point out, because there were journalists and lawyers, prominent legal experts, who pointed this out at the time, that we're literally overturning Nuremberg justice and the Eichmann trial justice because we did not accept that claim at the trial. So there it comes up in world history as well. And this leads us directly to the next point, which is one of my favorites, the Milgram authority experiments, the Stanley Milgram authority experiments, which were inspired by the only following orders defense of Eichmann during his trial. And this is another point well beyond Israel. Stanley Milgram experiment in Yale University in 1962, 63, whenever it was. I don't remember exactly the date, but it was right after the Eichmann trial. Here, I'm looking up the data here. I have it in my notes. Excuse me. It was in 1963 he submitted the results, so it was right before that. He was inspired by the Eichmann trial. So I don't know how that's well known. I think the authority experiments are very well known, how he gave electric shocks to individuals. It was acting. He was it was all acting. He had the people who he was experimenting on were they thought they were giving electric shocks to actors for making mistakes in reading, and he told the experimentees that he's testing if punishment helps learning abilities. But that wasn't really the experiment. He didn't tell them what the experiment was. The experiment was, would people listen to authority because they're just following orders, just like Eichmann said at the trial? And here he's doing it to American citizens who did not go through any Nazi racial ideology. They did not go through any Nazi government. They did not go through any anti-Semitism, because this had nothing to do with Jews. This was just about listening to authority. And would they administer what they thought were electric shocks to other people, and up to the point that it would be lethal, or supposedly lethal. Obviously they weren't, it was fake, it was acting. But what they thought would be lethal electric shocks, literally killing someone. Obviously, again, they were not killing anyone because it was fake. It was acting. But what the people thought, that they were actually killing someone behind the wall. And what Milgram found was that most people did. Most people went ahead and administered these what they thought were electric shocks, up to the point that they actually pressed the danger button and gave someone what they thought was an electric shock powerful enough to kill them. And you can watch the footage of it, and you hear these actors who are very good. They say, "Oh yeah, I have a heart condition. Please don't give me that electric shock." And you see the individuals who are part of the experiment telling Milgram, who's this professor at Yale, and he's got this lab coat, and he looks like a person of authority. And he says, "No, you agreed to do this experiment, and you have to carry out this experiment. And I take responsibility. It's not your responsibility." That's a very, very important component of this whole experiment, is that Milgram tells them, it's my responsibility. If anything happens to these people through the electric shock, don't worry. You didn't do the crime. It's me. It's all on me. And that's how they go ahead and do it. They say, "Oh, it's not me. I'm innocent. I'm not the one doing it. It goes on this fancy schmancy looking professor from Yale. It's all his responsibility, so I can go ahead and press the button," which is incredible. And Milgram, it's, I think, another thing that's not well known. Milgram was a Jewish guy. He was born in the Bronx to Jewish parents. His parents were immigrants from Romania and Hungary, and he grows up in the 1940s. In other words, the Holocaust. Many of his parents' relatives are killed during the Holocaust. Some of his relatives who survived the Holocaust and came with Nazi Auschwitz tattoos on their arm, they came to New York after the war and stayed at the Milgram home until they found a place to live. In other words, he grows up as a teenager with survivors in his home, and his parents talking about the relatives that they lost. And I don't think he was Orthodox, but he was some sort of traditional conservative reform. Who knows what type of Jew he was, but he had some sort of bar mitzvah. And in his bar mitzvah speech, which was in 1946, he said, and I'm quoting, "As I find happiness in joining the ranks of Israel, the knowledge of the tragic suffering of my fellow Jews makes this an occasion to reflect upon the heritage of my people, which now becomes mine. I shall try to understand my people and do my best to share the responsibilities which history has placed upon all of us." And later on, he wrote to a friend of his, "I should have been born into the German-speaking Jewish community of Prague in 1922 and died in a gas chamber some 20 years later. How I came to be born in the Bronx hospital, I'll never quite understand." So Milgram is obsessed with the Holocaust from when he's a child. And he becomes the psychologist, prominent psychologist in Yale, and he follows the Eichmann trial intently, and he becomes astounded by Eichmann's defense of just following orders. And he decides to do these authority experiments, which were groundbreaking in the social psychology realm of how authority works and what people are willing to carry out because of authority, because of the Eichmann trial. So I think that's an amazing thing, that connection of the Eichmann trial and Jewish destiny to the realm of social psychology through Milgram, which is amazing. And by the way, Stanley Milgram's childhood friend in the Bronx, I think they were classmates in high school or something, was a fellow by the name of Phillip Zimbardo, who was not Jewish, who died, I think, just recently, just a couple of weeks ago or months ago, relatively recently. I saw it in the news. Phillip Zimbardo with the famous Stanford prison experiment a decade later in the 1970s, which explained, also in the realm of social psychology, explained situational variables, conformity, how the environment and social pressures affect people and make them more sadistic and be able to commit crimes in the right social environment and the social pressures of that environment. And Phillip Zimbardo also, in his Stanford prison experiment, which was quite a controversial experiment, and not everyone in the social psychology community agrees to the findings of that experiment, but the Stanford prison experiment, at least in Phillip Zimbardo's view, was also trying to prove something regarding the Nazis, and also was related to the Eichmann trial, about how SS officers, given that they were in the environment of the concentration camps, of the death camps, of the SS as a criminal organization, how they were able to do things that they did, and how these conformist tendencies in specific environments can enhance a person's abilities to commit horrible crimes. So again, the Zimbardo experiment, Stanford prison experiment, can be related back to the Eichmann trial and the Holocaust as well. Also, obviously, and this is another third experiment that's very famous as well, the third wave experiment. The wave in 1967, just a couple of years after the Eichmann trial, was also influenced by the Eichmann trial in Palo Alto, California, a high school where the high school teacher, Ron Jones, who's also Jewish, and I think he's also still alive, was influenced by the Eichmann trial and by the Milgram experiment of just a couple of years before to explain to his high school class what the Holocaust was all about and how is it possible for the Nazis to carry out this crime. So that is the just a few elements of what I find to be interesting about the large, huge after effects of the trial, which go well beyond the Jewish people, well go beyond confronting the Holocaust as Israeli society and the Jewish people and the survivors and the witnesses and the victims' perspective and their testimony, but also to the perpetrator side of things and the perpetrator research and all these social psychology and well beyond just the courtroom in Yerushalayim. So it's a major historical event, the Eichmann trial, the shockwaves, which we're still dealing with today. And like I said, Eichmann himself is almost a footnote in all of this because it goes beyond, excuse me, I'm sorry. It goes beyond him as a person and his personal crimes, and it goes about examining the essence of humanity on the perpetrator side, on the bystander side, and of course on the victim side as well. So this is Yehuda Geber with Jewish History Soundbites. You can reach me at yehuda@yehudageber.com for questions, comments, sources, tours, trips, sponsorships, and lectures. You can subscribe to Jewish History Soundbites on your favorite podcast platform. Tell your friends and family about the podcast. That is the best way to support the podcast, by spreading the word about it. You can also leave a review and a rating on whatever platform you use. That is also very helpful to the podcast in more ways than you can imagine. So please do that as well. And be in touch with me with any feedback that you had about both the Eichmann trial series specifically, what topics you'd like to hear about in general. And we have lots more content coming on Jewish History Soundbites in the coming weeks, and I hope you enjoyed.